Good afternoon and a very warm welcome to the first webinar being hosted by Axis as a part of the Livelihoods India webinar series. The Livelihoods India initiative, as many of you might be aware, is a national level platform set up by Axis in 2010, the aim of which is to understand and assess the key issues and challenges that poor face in sustaining their livelihoods and moving them to sustainable levels. This webinar series will continue to provide a forum for issues that are topical in the current pandemic context. The theme of today's webinar is Migrant Workers in Corporate India, Lessons from COVID-19. As we all know, amongst the worst affected due to the ongoing pandemic in India is its huge migrant population. COVID-19 has thrown up unanticipated challenges for them that are difficult to grapple with. Due to the long lockdown, not only have they been dislocated, but millions of migrant workers have had to deal with the loss of livelihood and income, food shortage, and uncertainty about their future. To the crisis from the government, the civil society, as also the corporate sector who employ these migrants. In light of the extreme adversities and exclusion that migrants have faced during the lockdown, today's webinar aims to look at the response of corporate India and jot down the learnings to improve migrants' lives and protect them from such crises as the one induced by COVID-19 lockdown. Before I introduce our esteemed panelists, a few important announcements for the participants. Video and audio will be muted for all participants at all times during the webinar. In case you have any questions for the panel, please type it in the Q&A chat box on your screen, and the questions will be addressed and answered towards the end of the webinar. This webinar is being recorded, and we'll be sharing the link with you after the completion of the event. In case of any incidents of hacking, we'll terminate the discussion immediately. We are very excited today to be joined by an eminent panel with representation from the corporate sector, the civil society, and research and academia. We have with us Dr. Ravi Srivastava, Director at the Center for Employment Studies, Institute for Human Development. His main areas of research include labor and employment, migration, social protection, and informal sector, amongst others. We are also joined by Mr. Amitabh Behar, CEO of Oxfam India. Over the years, he has worked on building people-centric campaigns, alliances for social justice, and linking micro-activism to macro changes. Our third panelist today is Dr. Orlando Ruthven, who works on youth employment and labor standards in India. She is currently heading the workforce program at Gramvani. Previously, she has worked with ILO, Impact, ODI, and DFID. From the corporate sector, we have with us today Mr. P.S. Narayan, who is the Global Head Sustainability and Social Initiatives at Wipro Limited. He is also the Managing Trustee and Head of Wipro Foundation and visiting faculty at Azim Premji University. And our fifth panelist today from the corporate sector, Mr. Anirban Ghosh, who leads sustainability work in the Mahindra Group as Chief Sustainability Officer. Anirban has played a key role in the group's expansion into agriculture business since 2010. Welcome panelists, and thank you for your time today. I'm happy to introduce our moderator for this panel, Mr. Shankar Venkateshwaran, who is advisor on sustainability, business, and society. He is also the operating partner and head ESG eCube Investment Advisors and chairperson of Oxfam India. His last full-time position was as the chief of the Tata Sustainability Group. With this, I hand over to Shankar to initiate and take forward the discussion. But before that, I would like to inform you that over 350 participants have registered for today's webinar. Many have already joined in, and we are hoping that many more will join in as we begin this engaging conversation. Over to you, Shankar.
Thanks, Pooja. And let me begin by thanking Access for organizing this wonderful webinar. Let me start also by adding my welcome to the discussants today. Many are our old friends, many we've worked with before, and it's a pleasure to have you all together in today's next hour and a half to discuss this interesting issue. I think, as Pooja said, COVID-19 has exposed many fault lines that we knew existed. And clearly the issue around migrant workers is one of them. And this is sort of something that has hit the headlines and hit us very hard. What is interesting about the migration and migrant workers issue is also the interesting overlaps it has with business, because that's the other big impact that COVID has had on us. Apart from the health impact, the economic impact, and the link between the economics and rights of workers is something that is obviously of great concern to all of us. And that's the reason why we thought such a webinar as today's will be an interesting conversation to have. I don't think that this is a topic that can be closed in one conversation. So I would look at this as the beginning of hopefully several conversations to take us to a point where we understand this better and understand the kind of responses that we need to make to this issue better. So think of this as a start and not the end of that conversation. I think, as Pooja said, we have three different and what are the lessons that we can draw from that to make sure that in the future, when we have such a situation, things have to be, can and have to become better. And we would look for inputs from Anirban and Narayan from a corporate perspective, recognizing, of course, that they come from very large corporations and not necessarily ones that directly employ the kind of migrant workers that we are talking about. But certainly they are there in the value chain, in their supply chains. And so there are some insights and inputs that is of relevance to them, and we look forward to those inputs. So we will have these discussions going forward, and we would hopefully have some time for inputs and comments and questions from all of you as participants, because as I said, this is a dialogue and this is the beginning of that dialogue. So we look forward to your inputs as we go forward. So let's start and try and make the most of the time that we have available. And I'd like to start with you, Ravi. Given the amount of work that you've done in this space, and you and I have talked about and discussed this for many decades now, including from the time when you were in the Sengupta committee on unorganized sector. So if you can just start by giving us a sort of an overview on what is happening with migrant workers in India. What numbers are we talking about? Where do they come from? What do they do? What kinds of work do they get engaged in? And perhaps ending it with giving us a sense of where do they fit into this corporate world, into the corporate supply chain or value chain world. If you could just start giving us that big picture, Ravi, that would be great. Thank you.
Thanks, Shankar. So I'll try and give this big picture in the 5 or 6 minutes that has been allocated to me. I would not like to step into other people's shoes and time. To begin with, our estimates, my estimates are that roughly about 40 to 50 million migrants have walked across state boundaries, traveled back across state boundaries to go to their respective villages, towns, during the course of this pandemic. And here I'm leaving out many millions of migrants who walked or traveled within their own states. So these figures, as you can see, are much larger than the figures of people who have been assisted by government to travel back, which have been at the outside about 10 million. So for every one person assisted by government, 3 people or 4 persons have actually gone back unassisted to their own state. So let me just quickly share a short slide with you to get across the key issues that you've talked about. First of all, we've talked about this crisis, and Amitabh and others following me will say a great deal more about it. So why did this happen? It happened because of the high precarity of the work and the living spaces that are occupied by migrants, and their exclusion from the social protection regimes. Whatever governments tried to do, others tried to do, could not reach them. I will very quickly outline the following 3 things. First of all, the magnitude and nature of migration, the labor migrants. Secondly, the growth in labor migration. This is something we often don't speak about, which has been in tandem with increasing precarity of employment in India, and then the prevalence across sectors in the corporate sector and in value chains. So yeah, okay. So just to inform the participant that we broadly speak about three types of migrants. One are permanent migrants. At the present juncture, here I'm only talking about the work of the world of work. So roughly about 160 million, 16 million workers who are permanent migrants. Then we need to speak about long-term circular migrants. And these are migrants who've acquired a foothold in urban areas, but who still look back to rural areas. And then we speak about short-term circular migrants who go out of the rural areas, work in urban areas or destinations, and then go back to the rural areas. So if you look at the figures on the screen, of all the circular migrants, 85 million, the long-term circular migrants, about 70 million are those who are in precarious jobs, precarious occupations. All the ones who are short-term circular migrants, about 55 million, are in precarious jobs. Out of the long-term migrants, about 30% work across state boundaries. So about 25 million work across state boundaries, 2.5 crores, mainly in services and manufacturing, and about half of them are low-skilled. Among the short-term circular migrants, half work interstate. So about 27 million work interstate, mainly in construction, manufacturing, services, and agriculture, and about 70 to 80% are low-skilled. So basically, the number of workers working across states, interstate workers who are circular migrants, in my estimate, are roughly 50 to 55 million. Now, if you look at this figure, this basically shows you that the growth in the migrant and the informal, among the informally employed people, the precarious employment in the country outside agriculture, and the growth in the migrant worker population, the circular migrant worker population, both have increased. In precarious employment, informal employment has increased from about 170 million to about 230 million. And if you look at the numbers of circular migrants, their share in precarious employment increased over this period from 47% to 57%. So as of this date, almost 3/5 of all those who are precariously employed outside agriculture happen to be circular migrants. And if you look at the share now in formal sector employment and in incorporated public sector, private limited companies, private limited, public limited companies, here you see, I don't have figures here separately for migrants and non-migrants. So here I'm speaking about total informally employed persons, those who are in precarious employment. If you look at public limited, private limited companies, the numbers of people who are informally employed in these, directly informally employed, has gone up from about 28 million in 2004-05 to 45 million in 2017-18, this 15-year period. And overall, in the formal sector as a whole, these numbers went up from about 54 million, 5.5 crores, to about 6.5 crores. So there has been a growth in overall employment. There has been a sharp growth in these 15 years in those who are informally employed, both in the public limited, private limited space, and also across the formal sector. The source and destination issue, I think, is better understood. About half the circular migrants come from UP and Bihar. About 40% come from 6 other states: Chhattisgarh, Odisha, Rajasthan, MP, West Bengal, and Jharkhand. And the remaining 10% come from middle and high income states. And the destination states are majorly the northern, the northwestern, western, and southern states. Now, just a small picture of where they are. So if you look at industrial sectors and where corporate presence is higher, it's basically construction, garment and textiles, automotive components, food and beverages. These are among the important sectors. But here we need a lot more work to establish, the numbers of migrants, because as I said, we have a firmer grip on overall informal employment, not so much on the share of migrants among them. Secondly, they are more predominant in the lower tiers of the value chain. and SMEs. So rather than in the top tier, there's a smaller predominance of circular migrants. As you go down the value chain to second tier, third tier companies, there's a much higher prevalence of informal work as also the circular migrants. If you look at their pattern of recruitment, as far as circular migrants are concerned, about 50% are recruited through contractors. But if you look at their presence in factories and so on, wherever they work, then 80 or 90% of them are employed by contractors or work under contractors. So direct employment, particularly in the formal sector, as far as migrants is concerned, very low. Generally, they're indirectly employed. And I'll end here, Shankar, with just one, let me say, a curiosity, if you don't want to call it a lead question, is this, that how much of, forget about the figures, the millions and the crores, because what I have put out are also estimates. How much of this has been known to the corporate leaders? The precarity, the growth in precarity, and within that, the presence of migrant workers. And if indeed it was not known very well, why not? So I'll stop here, Shankar. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Ravi. That was a very helpful overview. So we're talking very large numbers. We're talking large growths, and it has been increasing. And what's also very interesting is the sort of concentration of where they're coming from. And I think to some extent we knew this intuitively, or we heard it every now and then. But I think it's very stark when you put those numbers out there and take a look. And I think your last question is obviously an important one, and one that I hope Anirban and Narayan will reflect on and perhaps give us some sense of what their thinking is. But I know, having worked in the corporate sector myself and have dealt with the issue of sustainability in supply chains, I think one of the things that most companies suffer from is lack of visibility beyond a tier 2 supply chain player. So you know who's supplying to you, you may know something about who's supplying to your supplier, but beyond that, there is complete opacity. And whether there is attempts to find out more about it is a different question. But I think we will park that and we need to come to that, because that's an important part of it. But Amitabh, let me now come to you. I think, given this overview at a very macro level, I know that Oxfam has been doing incredible work at both trying to get more visibility to the issue of migrant workers during the pandemic. I know that, as Oxfam, you've been one of the big advocates of bringing this voices to the larger public. But at the same time, also working with them on the grassroots. So why don't you take us through a bit of the experiences you've had in terms of what you've been doing and what's been the lessons and what's been the sort of areas of distress that you and your colleagues have been going through as you work through this situation. Amitabh.
Thank you, Shankar. And it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. And thank you, Professor Srivastava, for those big picture comments, and really the question that you're asking is central to us. But let me start by talking of 3 abiding images from this crisis that we have seen. And I'm sure everybody's seen them, but I just want us to go back to that, because I think we've started with the mind, but let's go to the heart also. And those 3 abiding images. The first one, I'm sure most of us saw that, a child sleeping on the suitcase, and the parents dragging the suitcase. They're going from one urban center to somewhere way off. The second, this was in Agra, and this was really heartbreaking for me when I saw that there was some milk spilled on the road, and a poor person was actually trying to use his hands as a cup and get whatever milk was on the road, to get it in a glass so that probably would be able to feed his children. And the third, which has also become a celebrated case of the girl cycling with her dad from Gurgaon to Delhi. So I would say that what we have seen is absolutely devastating. When the pandemic started, people were saying this is unprecedented. We have not seen this. But what we really saw, even the images, the the trauma that we have seen is absolutely unparalleled at this level. Oxfam, as many of you would know, works on humanitarian crisis, while we also work on developmental issues, on equality and rights. But very often these humanitarian disasters are localized. The magnitude that we are seeing has been so immense that I would say that we are still grappling with it. Uh, I just want to say that everybody in this story is essentially talking about the health component of it. So I'm very happy that we are getting into this conversation, and I would really say that, and that's what a lot of experts are saying, that we are still a few weeks away from, even in a city like Delhi, to hit the peak of the health crisis. But what we have seen is a tremendous human tragedy, which is clearly policy induced. And the kind of lockdown, this is not to get into a debate about whether we needed a lockdown or not, but the way it was implemented, the human suffering that we have seen has been so enormous that we need to really get into these questions also. So this is not just about a human crisis, it's a policy created crisis, and we must squarely put the onus of responsibility on the policy makers. So in all this, as civil society, because Shankar was interested in hearing from me what's civil society doing. And very often, this is what Oxfam does, but having worked with different actors, there are broadly three phases in the crisis which people work with. The first is the immediate relief. The second is what we call the recovery. And the third is the rehabilitation and the resilience building piece. Based on our experience in the first few days, I was telling my colleagues that let's prepare for 2-3 weeks of recovery. Sorry, 2-3 weeks of relief. But trust me, I still get calls, and from across the country, where people are saying that we still need relief. People are still sleeping hungry. So a significant chunk, Shankar, I would, it's sad, but the civil society's effort have so much been around providing relief primarily. So, and that's because of the enormity of the problem. We are moving from the relief bit. We've started talking of now the recovery. And in terms of the recovery, so I'll not go into what we have done in relief as Oxfam, but I would say providing food has been one of the biggest challenges, helping in transportation, providing residence, and so on. So those are few of the things that in terms of the initial phase of relief that's been done. In recovery, now we are trying to work with communities. We have just started cash transfers. That's one way of kickstarting the local economy, giving some cash to the migrant workers that we have been talking of. And as Professor Shawsa was saying, most of these people do not have cash with them. So that's the third. Few of the things, I from my experience, I'll talk of. Just to give you small examples, but that's what civil society has been doing broadly. We started what we've been calling as a dignity kitchen in Ahmedabad, where we helped, and it was interesting. These migrant workers wanted to go back, could not, but did not have cash to buy food. But they said, we'll not take food from you. We have our dignity. Just help us in setting up the kitchen and provide us the provisions, and we'll do our own food. We started, on the other hand, something called the Project Pratik, where our lorries with food, with slippers, were actually moving around, just reaching out to these people. So it's been an enormous amount of work. We've also worked, civil society has worked in terms of working with PPEs, but maybe that's really not the focus of this conversation, but also working in the home villages. So as you know, that's also a conversation worth having, that when many of these people were reaching their homes, they were not allowed back inside their villages, and they were made to literally live outside again, horror stories that in somewhere in Bengal, a few of them were living on a tree, which I couldn't understand why were they living on a tree, but they had to live on a tree. So working with those local communities and at multiple levels, helping them understand what's COVID, helping them ensure that there's no discrimination, but also helping the panchayats in terms of setting up quarantine wards in Orissa, where we work very actively on disasters, converting the disaster shelter homes into quarantine wards. So that's been, I would say, the broad spread of the work that's happened. But let me just end with two things, and which is critical from a civil society perspective. Uh, the the enormous amount of volunteering that we have seen, and people really coming forward from all walks of life, has been unprecedented. So the crisis is unprecedented, but I would say that the people coming forward to help, and in particular the migrant workers, has been remarkable. And this help has ranged from providing food to money to actually volunteering in spite of the big worries people had. So that I really wanted to say, that's been one of the silver linings of the whole story. And the second, and I want to leave with that, because that's a conversation we must have, and particularly when we're also discussing it with the corporate world, is what's the role of civil society? The current government, which has been, I would say, fairly uncharitable to the work civil society does, suddenly started reaching out to civil society. And what we have seen is we are quite welcome now from Niti Aayog to state governments in terms of doing service delivery. So on the one hand, it clearly demonstrates the complete failure of the state, the capacity of the state. Uh, Let me just smuggle in one line. They even have the audacity to do away with whatever labor rights we have had. It's in that context we are asked to do service delivery. Uh, but we have not been allowed to ask tough questions. And I want to come back onto that, the accountability piece. But civil society's role, you're welcome, more than welcome, if you do services, and we happily hand over those services to you. India Today study actually said that at least at one particular point of time, civil society was feeding more people than the governments. So that I would, that should shame the government, and governments. I mean, it's not just the union government; it's also the state governments. But civil society, wherever, even now, when we have tried asking some tough questions, we have not got a response. And just one final line, that while we are doing all this, we're constantly also looking at other policy questions. So violence against women is something that's actually increasing. Children and education, what's these online classes doing? So there's a whole range of actions which civil society is still working with. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Amitabh. I mean, that's a whole range of stuff, and I think, as you said, there's been a sudden uh, recognition of the positive role that civil society plays, and I think it does ask the behove the question that you said: what is the role going forward? Is it only to provide services? Clearly, if that is the deal, civil society will probably say we're not interested. We need to do more than that. But I think it is something that we need to discuss. But even in the context of our topic, I think it's an interesting conversation in terms with companies. What role can civil society play in this whole issue around migrant workers going forward? And I think we need to come back to that, and we will come back to that. Thank you, Anita. Orlando, very quickly to you. Thank you for being here. And I think you were, when we were speaking earlier, you were telling me about some of the work that Gram Vani does or has been doing during this crisis in terms of trying to get voices of migrant workers who've been found themselves in the situation that they did, with almost nobody there to help them and with no resources available. What was the voices that you were hearing, and give us a sense of what were the kind of asks, or what were the kind of expectations that you were hearing from migrant workers who were stuck because of this pandemic?
Okay. Hi, everyone. Am I audible? Yeah? Great. So yes, I'll say a few words from the point of view of running a small migrant workers platform, which operates on IVR technology through the basic phone line. Gramvani runs 30 such platforms or so across different parts of India. And the platform that I'm drawing from today, it's called Saja Manch, and it's very much dedicated to interstate migrants, particularly those in the factory sector. So we tend to work at destination areas such as Delhi NCR, Ahmedabad, Tirupur, for example. So to access the platform, workers simply dial up the dedicated number, they wait for the callback, and then they receive it, and then they're listening to a playlist which they can navigate, and at any point they want, they can press the number 3 and file in their contribution with their own voice. So it's very flexible, very easy to use, doesn't require internet, doesn't require a smartphone, and it operates throughout India. So when lockdown was announced, very quickly we watched our platform explode with activity. And expressing a great deal of distress. And it was horrible to watch because, frankly, we're not really set up as a relief organization. So there was a frenzy of activity to liaise with civil society partners on the ground that Amitabh was outlining and get relief to these listeners as soon as we could. So we got through, we received about 8,000 calls for help across that 5-week core lockdown period. Yeah. So what I wanted to talk about today, because it's a session about migration and corporate India, I just wanted to remind us all the sort of dance of liability which went on around who all is going to pay lockdown wages, which meant in the end that nobody paid them. Yeah. So on the 24th of March, everybody was prevented from going to work and from going home. So obviously for interstates, that's a particularly severe situation because you don't stay out of state unless you're earning. It's very clear. Nobody can manage more than a few days away from the home state unless they're earning. So on the 29th of March, very quickly, the Home Ministry announced that employers were liable to pay full wages and they were not permitted to lay anybody off during the lockdown period. They didn't even give a date when this would end. They just said that that's what employers had to do. Yeah. They didn't offer any help in managing that wage bill. Then on the 30th of March, more theoretically good news for workers. There was an offer of 75% withdrawal facility, an express facility for all those PF Provident Fund holders. So things were beginning to look good for workers at that point. On the 2nd of April, activists Harsh Mander and Anjali Bhardwaj filed a PIL suggesting that it should be the government that actually foots this wage bill, predicting quite rightly that the employers would not be able to do it. But on the 7th of April, the Supreme Court refused that petition and said that it was not in a position to dictate what all the government should do. Yeah. And finally, after a long gap, on the 15th of May, after some receiving the pressure from various industry associations, the Supreme Court stayed the Home Ministry's order, which had been issued way back on the 29th of March, and saying that actually no employer could be prosecuted for not paying workers' wages, and it was now for workers and employers to negotiate whatever they could between them. So it left it was a period of great uncertainty, and the result was basically that very few lockdown wages were paid at all. In our data, and if we look at the big reports which are coming up from civil society players and activists, we've got, from our own data, we've got less than half of our listeners were even paid until the 21st of March. Yeah, whereas the wider figures from other reports are somewhat even worse than that. Employers felt justifiably aggrieved and upset with the government. It's completely not surprising that the government had given no to them about lockdown, some of them were at midshipment, trucks were on their way to port, and they were told to lock down and stop work, and then they were also told to foot the wage bill. It's not a reasonable request. Yeah. State governments also didn't feel much compulsion to pay. My mind is why did we get to this? Oh. Okay. Can you still hear me? Yeah. How did we get to this situation? We have a good report on the lockdown in Bangladesh, which suggests that the government there was much, much quicker to step in with a large relief package, which went straight to the formal sector through employers and reached 28 million workers, which is about 40% of the workforce, within 2 weeks. Yeah. Now, could we have done something similar in India? And with all the credentials which we've been growing among the workforce for many years, most of these workers, many of them have Provident Fund accounts, many more of them have Jan Dhan accounts. Through the Factories Act, through the various regulations, through even GST, we can get an estimate and we can reach these people. Even those workers with fairly good credentials, with a clear employer relationship, have been utterly let down. And meanwhile, the relief from the government in Russians was no better at all. So we left these workers completely in the lurch. So I just wanted to begin with that. That was the sort of thing that we had coming expressed over our audio platform. And I'll just end with a quote from one worker who manages to reach his home in Bihar and then files a report for us. And he says, employers are crying. If we let the workers leave, our work will suffer. But these are the same people who refused to help us in our time of need. Then they said their pockets were empty. So the question is, what can industry and can employers become more proactive so we can avoid this kind of crisis in the future? Yeah.
Thanks, Orlando. I think that was very helpful because it provided, it provided the flesh and bones around what we read and what we've been reading in the paper. And I think it becomes very real. But I think what you're also putting out there are a set of dilemmas, because these are not necessarily easily solvable, right? As you said, the government asked employers to pay, which ultimately didn't happen. Employers didn't know that this is what was going to come and hit them. So I think there was just a whole fog around the whole thing. And with no one really trying to find a solution around it, and people were suffering at the end of it. And that's the sort of net we get out of it. And so how do we make this, and how do we ensure this doesn't happen? And that's part of where we want to take this conversation forward. But let me come first to Narayan from Wipro. And Narayan, I want you to give us a perspective from a company's point of view. I'm also particularly interested to hear your perspective, because I think very few CEOs of companies said anything on the crisis of what happened to migrants. And Azim Premji was one who did actually say that, and he felt the pain. Anand Mahindra also talked about it. So two of you are perfect from the point of view of your leadership, understanding this and being empathetic to this. But just give us a sense of how did you folks at Wipro, when this happened, how did you see this? You do a lot of work on human rights issues. You're very familiar with them, Narayan. So I know that there are many multiple perspectives that you bring into this conversation. But even if you don't necessarily speak to what exactly Wipro might have done, because you're in a very different industry, but just a perspective from an employer as to what you do when you have a crisis like this. How have companies like yours responded to this kind of an issue? So if you could just give us some sense of how that has been, and what has been the challenges that you've been doing.
Sure. Thank you very much, Shankar. And it's a pleasure and a great learning opportunity for me, personally and as a practitioner of sustainability, and to be part of this panel discussion. Let me start by placing a couple of caveats here. One is, a lot of what I'm going to say is going to be circumscribed or constrained by the sector that I come from, which is the IT services sector, and which, of course, does not have deep supply chains, and therefore we don't have a sense of the realities of migrant workers or informal workers the way other sectors have. That's one. Second, I think Anirban and I were chatting up just yesterday. There is and Shankar, you know this also very well. There is a vast difference between the way large organizations respond and the smaller organizations respond, not just to crisis letters, but even on matters of human rights and sustainability and so on. And I'm not venturing to say at all that large organizations are more virtuous than smaller, medium organizations. It's just that just by virtue of having access to more resources and a certain, let's say, a critical mass of people, resources, and networks and all of that, large organizations are able to respond in a way that at least visibly seems better. So therefore, what I'm going to say is not going to be the full picture in any way or representative of industry. But I will try to therefore wear two hats. One is a Wipro hat, and the other is I will allow me the flexibility of stepping outside the corporate boundary and speak as an individual or as an independent observer. I think as sustainability practitioners, one of the big learnings for us is whenever we have this opportunity to sidestep outside our circles and learn, from what we observe. The third thing is some of the stuff that we've done. What I'm going to talk about is really an integrated response, not just from Wipro, but a very, very large response from Azim Premji Foundation, which is the private philanthropy arm of Mr. Premji. So, but even so, so Wipro's is a part of that, and it's relatively much less. But even so, it sort of gives you a sense of the challenges that we faced and where we stand now. Let me start by saying that at the end of nearly 3 months after this lockdown started, do I have more clarity or do I have more questions in my mind? I think I have more questions in my mind. That's the first thing, and that's going to reflect on what I'm going to say. Individually, I think I'm a changed person after these 75 to 80 days. Changed because, while corporations have responded in the past to humanitarian crises like natural disasters, cyclones, floods, and so on. And some of us who are in sustainability, we do engage on social issues in some way or the other, be it education or livelihoods or ecology. But I don't think any of us anticipated a crisis of such intensity and scale, in such a short period of time. And on one hand, of course, if you decided to respond to it like we tried to do, that by itself is a life-changing experience, and you can put it to good use as you go along as a practitioner. But at the end of all this, I think there are more questions than answers. So let me say a couple of things in that regard. Our response from Wipro was, as Amitabh said, largely focused on humanitarian aid, very large scale of food relief, hygiene relief. Of course, we've also done significant work on healthcare in the past few weeks, and on livelihoods, we're beginning to do work, but it's been largely humanitarian work. Both in terms of working with civil society partners and distributing and funding support for dry rations and so on. Also directly from Wipro, we repurposed our kitchens in Bangalore, in Pune, in Kolkata. And until June 15th, we served about 2.7 million meals to about 2.5 lakh people. On one hand, we feel satisfied that we've tried to do something. On the other hand, it's a little discomforting that a corporation has had to do such a large humanitarian role. I'm not saying that we shouldn't have done it. We should have done it, and we should do it going forward. But if we have had to play such a large role in humanitarian assistance, then it does point to certain structural deficiencies and gaps in the overall macro system, which Professor Ravi Srivastava was alluding to and pointing to. Whether it is a direct abdication of responsibility by the organizations where these workers were employed, or I think more fundamentally, how did all this sort of build up over the years? Be it the informalization of the economy, the very large proportion of contract workers, the absence or the very weak presence of protection and security, to workers and so on. It has been building up. It's not that it just is an overnight phenomenon. So to me, I think the most disconcerting question on the table is, when you have a crisis like this, and if corporations like us have to respond on such a large scale on humanitarian assistance, then there's something seriously wrong with the system, right? And so what can we do with it? And I think in that answer to what we can do about it, I'm not suggesting at all that business must abdicate its responsibility and say it is a government's role or civil society's role. I think business plus must play a proactive role in shaping that agenda and the direction of what should be done in times of crisis like this, also in good times, in normal times. I'm going to pause here.
Thanks, Nalan. I think that's a very interesting observation, because what you're saying is this is not what you're designed to do as a company. But as a company, this is something everybody needs to do as a corporate citizen. You have to do it, but this is not necessarily what you're good at. But right. Then, therefore, the role going forward has to be to make sure that you don't have this kind of a situation on your set. I think that's an interesting perspective, and therefore, when we get into the next part of this discussion on how do we take this forward, I think we'll come back to some of these questions. And we'll also come back to the question that Ravi posed. And I think it's probably more relevant in the case of Anirban, whose group has a lot more manufacturing. The question that Ravi posed, if you can at some point address it on, are companies aware of the situation of migrant workers at different points of the value chain? But again, Anirban, a perspective from you, a perspective from a Mahindra group, because we all know the group, we all have great respect for it. So just wondering whether you could give us a sense of what happened within the Mahindra group when this happened. Some of the stuff we know. Anand Mahindra is not somebody who sits quietly, so there were voices that we heard. But a perspective from within, especially when it comes to the whole migrant workers issue and the supply chain issue. What are the things that happened?
Thank you, Shankar. Let me begin by first applauding the role that civil society has played in making sure that things that were terrible and there were very interesting players in civil society. Some of those NGOs were run by friends of mine who came out and sought donations and so on. So one got a very good sense of what was happening on ground and who was reaching out to whom. But frankly, it didn't surprise me, because this is not the first disaster situation that we've been in and that we are going to get out of. And every time we've seen civil society step up and play a very big role. We've seen it during floods, we've seen it during earthquakes, we've seen it during any conceivable disaster that there is. So in a sense, the ecosystem is government, civil society, corporations, everyone playing their role to make sure that they're able to handle a situation which may have just hit them from left field, but whatever it is a situation that has arrived. So I must applaud the role that civil society has played. Ravi showed how employment has grown and how the proportion of contract labor, shall we say, has grown in the number of people employed. This is not unknown to corporate sector at this point in time. And it is not unknown because you will remember that a few years ago, there was a lot of labor unrest in Haryana, specifically in Maruti. And that incident actually triggered a lot of deep thinking about the nature of employment in our factories and in our organizations, and the manner in which the people who are employed on contract and not employed on roles would be treated. Would there be any differentiation at all? What would be the benefits given, and so on. And there's been a vibrant conversation on all of that. There have been a lot of questions asked of corporations as to how are you dealing with your contract labor. There has been, I think, a reduction actually, at least in our companies, in terms of the proportion of contract labor vis-a-vis people on roles over time. And there is a declaration that we need to do on this differentiation in the BRR, the Business Responsibility Report, every year. So it is something that is in the know of management. It is something that it's in the know of boards. And it is something that the government knows very well because the data is provided every year. So this is not unknown. So if it is not unknown, you might ask the question, why were we taken by surprise? I think the answer lies somewhere else. The answer lies in the nature of the disruption that we experienced. If you look at the risk registers of businesses, even the best businesses that have anticipated how things could go wrong for their business probably don't have a line there that says there will be a lockdown in the entire country for 2 months' time. So it's the nature of the disruption that has taken or that has put us on the back foot, whether it has taken us by surprise or not, because that's another conversation saying that it was only a matter of when and not a matter of if and so on. But I don't want to go there. It's just the magnitude and the way in which this has come that has created a situation which we've never had to deal with before, that we had to deal with as we were on our feet and trying to do the best that we can. That a lot of things went wrong is not surprising, because when something so large happens suddenly, if everything were to go right, you would turn around and say, hey, was somebody orchestrating this or what? The big thing is that we should learn from this so that when the next big problem happens, we are way better prepared. And if there is an analogy, it is Hurricane Rita in Katrina and Rita in the US, and hurricanes after that, when that country has been so well prepared to deal with hurricanes, one of which I was personally present in and experienced how the government had learned from those experiences and were able to go forward. However, Shankar, you know that in our group, we've got a construction business, we've got automotive, we've got holidays business, and a whole variety of businesses. And if I look at the spectrum of people employed, we've got everyone of all shades somewhere in the group. So when you invited me to participate in this, I reached out to my colleagues in various different businesses and asked them, so what did we actually do on ground with the people who work with us? And the responses that I got across businesses showed that there was some sort of a package that was happening, that was being given out to our colleagues who work with us, whether on contract and who are in a precarious situation compared to the rest of us. So this set of things included wages, included food, money, medicines, accommodation wherever necessary, and in many cases, transportation back home. And here I was pleasantly surprised to learn that our dealers actually stepped up and helped provide vehicles for people to return back if they were returning back to the area in which they operated. So not just the company itself, but the dealers, perhaps even the suppliers, played a role in enabling the people who work with us in our ecosystem to have a reasonable degree of comfort. Now, we heard the numbers, the very 40 to 50 million people who went home, not necessarily helped by the government. And I've had the opportunity to engage with a few of them. And I could see, initially my hypothesis was people who weren't with their families wanted to go home. People who didn't have food wanted to go home. People who didn't have money wanted to go home. And then I would find a bunch of people who had everything but still wanted to go home. Some of them would turn around and say that, how long are we going to eat food for free? I want to go home and be with my people and, be in an environment I'm comfortable in. And as we got deeper and deeper into this, I think one of the realizations was it's not only about relief, it's about relief with dignity. And that's probably where, that's one thing that seems to cut across all the stories, the heartrending stories that we hear, the absence of dignity or the lack of dignity or our inability to provide relief with dignity. PS raised this question. He asked, is there something wrong in our country that corporations have to play such a large humanitarian role? Of course there is. Look at the stories you hear in the United States, which apparently has a social security net, where they tell you every week how many million people applied for unemployment benefits. Where do we apply for unemployment benefits if we lose a job? Where do we get some money to survive a couple of weeks if we lose a job? What sort of a social security net do we have? Now, at the beginning, I said that the magnitude of this was so large and so unanticipated that it's difficult to be prepared. So if we don't have a social security net, which is strong enough to support such large numbers for a period of 2 or 3 months, we shouldn't be surprised, because I don't think we anticipated this at all. But then we should be very disappointed if the next time it happens, our social security net is not much stronger than what it was this time. Let me close by making one last comment. We hear this word essentials a lot, essential services are provided, the essentials are available to people and so on. In one of the webinars, one conversation went into what is an essential SDG. And there, it's just a thought. If you see, thanks to this lockdown situation, SDG 8, which is decent work and economic growth, seems to have taken a massive hit. And just because SDG 8 has taken a massive hit, there's collateral damage on a whole bunch of other SDGs, like no poverty, like zero hunger, and a whole bunch of them. And even though the environmental SDGs seem to be doing better, we are not any happier. So 2 clear takeaways. 1, SDG 8 is precious. And 2, not having SDG 8, but having great environmental SDGs is of no use to anybody at all. We've got to have them both together. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anirban. That's a very interesting thought. In fact, SDG 8 is actually the core. And when we start talking about building back better, that is where we need to actually make sure we start, especially the corporate sector. So I think that's a very interesting perspective. I know we are desperately behind time. I'm personally not disappointed, because I think that the richness of this conversation is important. And as I said, I still see this as a first of a few conversations, because I think the issue is too large and complex for us to be able to conclude. But let's start moving towards that. Let's start getting some ideas on where do we go from here. So let me start with you, Orlando, just very quickly. And I also want you to bring in your earlier experiences with ILO and so on put that into the pot. How do we build back better? What is the lessons? I think Anirban was very eloquent about the way he put it, saying that we should be surprised if that this happened, but we should be very disappointed if it happens again. So how do we make sure that we don't get disappointed? What is your prescription or a set of prescriptions to make sure that we do this better, especially from the role that companies and the corporate sector? Alana.
Thanks, Shankar. So I think it's time we all recognized a couple of things. The importance of the interstate and the migrant workforce. We have to start fully recognizing that and building that into the way government and employer and social security operates. As Ravi has told us, it's a good 20% or so of the total workforce. That's the interstate. If we include the intrastate, it'll be more. The other thing we have to get real about is the fact that huge numbers of jobs are precarious. Definitely. We've watched a shrinkage of permanent employment, which of course offered its own security, but there's less and less of that about. So in the context of huge numbers of precarious jobs, many of them do have a clear employer relationship. Yeah. So what I would like to see discussed today is a social security system which is employer linked, yeah, but which incorporates all workers who broadly have a clear employer relationship, regardless of how they are formally categorized as casual, contract, permanent, regular, organized, unorganized. The point is that we can identify an employer, yeah, so we have to work on that. And the second part of it is we're not just talking about employer payouts, because there is an enormous stress on employers as well. India is increasingly global, and it's very, very difficult for global companies to manage social security on their own. So although the employer is the link and is the route to social security, I think what we need to talk about is various schemes through that route, which incorporate the government and the employer and indeed the worker, him or herself, as contributors. Yeah. So I just wanted to put one idea of what such a scheme might look like, and I'd be very interested to get feedback. In our Saja Munch Migrants platform, we end up receiving a huge number of grievances related to the Provident Fund. As I said at the beginning, most of our listeners are factory sector, but I believe we don't have more than a handful of permanent workers among our listeners. They're all hired through contract or they're hired on daily wages. But they are visible. They are employer linked. They have credentials. Many of them would have an ID card. Many of them would have a PF account, at least something. Yeah, at least there's a continuous relationship with the employer. So a few years ago, as we all know, the PF switched from its old long employer-related numbers to the unique account number, the UAN. Yeah, and I just wondered whether we could just talk about whether that shift could be a sort of good metaphor or a good starting point to talk about a much broader product which could incorporate a variety of sectors. We're not saying that the PF and the UAN system itself needs to be expanded to the unorganized sector, etc. But the logic of what is the UAN? The UAN is now a unique number which is portable from one employer to the next. It means its use depends on having an employment relationship, but full access to the account can be maneuvered largely, not completely, but largely by the worker and by the account holder. Yeah. Of course, there are two deficiencies in the PF system which still survive. One is that the registration process itself still depends on the employer, so that we have a huge number of problems relating to the fact that whoever put in the original details put them in wrongly, and that's usually the contractor or the employer. Yeah, and the other issue is that the access is very strictly.
Sorry, Orlando, if I may interrupt. Sorry,
yeah.
I think let's not get into too much of detail on
Okay.
but I understand the principle of what you're saying.
So yeah,
Keep the employer and the relationship with the employer central, but unique to the worker, and find a way to sort of provide those linkages through the employer. I think that's the basic point around the social security.
So just to finish, exactly. I mean, let's not get into detail. There are still problems, but it has the potential of being an online system which can be managed by the worker and portable from one employer to the next. And potentially the same sort of system could be envisaged for schemes which are contributed directly by government as well, which are nonetheless employment linked social security. Yeah, so that's the idea. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks. So I think a lot of thinking and mechanisms around social security where the employer plays a role. Ravi, if I can come to you, and you've been sort of thinking about this for a long time, and I know you've also written about a lot of these ideas. But which are the ones that you think, especially after the pandemic, the one that there is a sense of urgency about it, and we need to sort of get going on that, where companies like the ones we have here could play a significant role in enabling that to happen. Ravi, you're muted, Ravi.
Yeah. So I think there are three. Let me just narrow down to three basic issues. One is, how much of informality are we willing to live with in workplaces? We've seen this rise over a period of time, and we know that the migrant crisis was related, very, very centrally related to the nature of the workforce that we've created. How much of it, and it's been growing over a period of time. That's the one question. Secondly, what kind, and this links up with what Anirban says, what kind of a social security structure do we envisage for this country as a whole? And the third is, how do we look at the citizenship rights of workers who move from one place to another place? I think these, to my mind, these are three central questions. And each of these questions is linked to a whole variety of other issues, including the health dimension of the pandemic. Because when you look at informality, when you look at the nature of living spaces, the nature of the workspaces of the migrant, and you see then how ill-prepared we are to deal with the next pandemic. Forget about this one, because we are going through it, but even the next one, if it comes along the way, how do we want to deal with it? And in that context, the whole question of the labor codes, which is on the agenda, although this is not only a question of labor law, it's also a question of policy. It's a question of how do you actually imbue people with their constitutional rights. But I think we need to, as people who are interested in these questions, need to talk about this in great detail. If going forwards, if the labor code, the OSH code, and the social security code, and the industrial relations code do not reflect the impact of the pandemic on the working population, then I think all of us would have failed in our jobs. When we look at the recommendations and what we can think about, Orlando talked about it from the lens of the formal sector. The NCUS, of which I was a member, almost 15 years ago had talked about universal registration, universal social security, portability of rights. I think the NCUS gave an excellent framework on which governments, employers, and others could have built upon. It also gave a very vast framework, a very broad framework of labor law changes, because what we need to do is to unify the labor market, to move towards a unified labor market regime. I would just want to say that I think we need to think about these things going forward. I heard excellent things from Narayan and Anirban, and I know that there have been many employers who have spoken very well on the kind of the impact of what has happened in the last few days. But you can literally count them on your fingertips in this country. And when there was a concerted attack on labor rights, by state governments. And this happened, this was an orchestrated attack. This doesn't happen. The fact of the matter is that there was not a loud enough outcry demolishing the entire labor law architecture in this country. 12-hour working day, maternity rights go in UP, social security goes, and so on and so forth. So I think going forward, we have to work together. We have to work together to create working spaces, places for working class rights, in which both industry and workers and the country can progress in a direction of inclusive development. How do we bring about inclusive growth? This is the beginning of a dialogue, and I think it's a very important dialogue with respect to that objective in mind.
Yeah, thanks, Ravi. I think a lot of work to be done, a lot of thinking to be done, but I think the direction is what you're saying is very clear. And what you're also saying is that it requires multiple stakeholders to come to the table and sit and work it out, because it's in everyone's interest to find a solution around that. But I think the fundamental question is what you said right at the beginning. How much informality can we live with? Or should we be living with informality at all? I think that's, to my mind, a very, very fundamental question, because that then takes into account the whole question around security and social security and rights. So, yeah, great. Thanks. Amitabh, your thoughts on this going forward?
Thank you, Shankar. So, what I would do is, let me just give you 4 or 5 clusters of thoughts. The first 2 are more in terms of what civil society could do, and particularly with such a large group of corporates here and the partnership that we've talked of. So one is just to initially talk of flexible funding. So a lot of support that comes from the corporates to the civil society in the relief phase. As in, I work very closely with Wipro and Narayan, and it was fantastic to get flexible funding where we were told in the morning that you can start work. But we've also worked with agencies where we've been told within 3 days you have to spend money like this if you are going to get the next tranche. So at this moment, understanding the messiness of the situation and the dynamism that's needed, I think flexible funding, and I think for civil society, it is a complete havoc, and we'll need to really relook at how support comes from the corporates. The second, I would say, again, in line with this is, and what I've earlier said, investing in accountability questions. So I think that's a huge part of the support that's needed from the corporates. As in, I do think that corporates also need to ask these accountability questions, both of the corporate sector itself, but also of the governments. And so much of our time, energy, resources go into just relief, and it is not going to solve the problem. And there are structural causes for it, and many of those structural causes have already been flagged. So can we start looking at least one part of our work really focused on questions of accountability? The third I wanted to say is really, a cluster of issues, and it will be critical to now zoom out, and that's what I think all our panelists have done, out of just the question of the migrant workers, and identify the issues on which we need to work. And I would identify 3. One, the public health system as a fundamental right. I think this is the moment where it's clear that we'll need to move into looking at a far more robust public health system and see it as a right. The second is, I think Professor Srivastava talked a lot about it, just understanding the urban spaces, how the urban spaces are designed from the settlements to the workspaces, so that there needs a significant amount of investment. It's not just enough to set up an industry and let the urban center develop in its own haphazard way. There has to be now serious rethink in terms of what's happening. The third is the question of the livelihoods, and again, it's been talked of, and again, corporates very happy to just do CSR. People like you have been championing the transition from a CSR to responsible business, but this is the moment, if we don't put business human rights at the center of the entire design of corporates, the corporate citizenship that we keep talking of, I think we'll not make headway. And the fourth is the whole question of social security. And I think it's a larger question of the social contract. So at one level, I do agree with the group here, which is kind of, looking at what's the responsibility of the corporates. But it is a larger social contract question. And how is our country designed is also fundamental. And therefore, the entitlement and the rights as a fundamental framework needs to be brought back. And finally, just as a more ambitious thought, Shankar, this is probably the moment to take that pause, as in the virus has made us take that pause. But is it really possible that when we reboot ourselves, we reboot a far more humane economy, far more sustainable economy? Is it really possible? As in, and if we don't at this moment also start looking at what it means, more formalization, more social security, we've got the elements of it. But if we don't fundamentally relook at rebooting in a different way, sadly, we'll probably be back at where we were. Thank you.
Thanks, Amitabh. I think that's a very profound thought, because it's often said if you don't learn from history, you're bound to repeat it. And I think this is certainly the time to reboot, and it's time to throw business as usual out of the window. And I think everyone who's sort of involved in this needs to play that role. So I think that's a very, very important sort of philosophical change of mind, which will then enable a lot of the other points that we're talking about to happen. So great. Narayan, your thoughts. And I'm particularly, both, I think Orlando also alluded to some of the potential use of technology. And since you come from a company that is so great at technology, I'm also wondering what's the role of technology in trying to enable some of these things to happen, portability, formalization, and so on. But I don't want to push you to a corner on that, but just it's too tempting to not ask somebody from the IT sector to ask about the potential for IT. But sorry, and any comments on what the others said will also be helpful. Thank you.
Sure. Thanks, Shankar. I'll answer the technology part last. But so I want to start with where Amitabh left off. I think at least one of the good things that has emerged is that we hear a lot from the Davos crowd or equivalent talk about this philosophical reset of business and its social contract. So, whether that's going to move beyond conversations to actualization is a moot point, but it's good that that conversation is happening. And I think that must happen. And I can't help, saying this as one of the architects of the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, Shankar. I'm sure you will know this better than any of us, that we can probably use that as an important lever in some manner to bring about the systemic change in the mindset of business and the way it sees its social contract. It will take time. It's not going to happen uniformly across. We all know that, but I think we have to start that journey sooner rather than later. So I would think that the NAP, the National Action Plan on Business and Human Rights, the first pillar of government's role, and then the business role, pillar 2, we've already done a lot of work on that. But if we can implement that in the true spirit and also in the letter in which it is framed, that would be significant progress. So we can just keep our fingers crossed and hope that happens. Very specifically on this matter of social security, I want to say two interrelated things. One is it cannot happen without government as a mediator of it. The government must mediate that change structurally, in the direction of what all of us have been saying. But business by itself, will respond only within a larger regulatory and institutional framework. You can't expect the majority of business to act in, enlightened collective interest and saying that, for example, Anirban and I were talking yesterday that can we have when you have severance pay of several months for CEOs, why can't businesses have severance pay of 2 months for its lowest rung of workers through a fund of some kind, where they probably like deferred benefits like Provident Fund. They deduct something from salary, but they also contribute, right? So you have a severance pay endowment fund of some kind. So when something like this happens, you actually pay 2 months' salaries, right? But to expect the majority of business to act in enlightened collective interest is not realistic, and therefore there has to be larger regulatory and institutional changes that have to happen on social security. We all know the enforcement problem, that even if you have laws, enforcement doesn't follow naturally, and in fact it is in most cases probably partial, but that's not an excuse for not having a framework like this. So I mean that's the way I think, at least in the immediate and near future business going forward on this, along with civil society and government, in terms of the structural matters. On technology, of course, technology it did play a very important role even in this crisis. It's going to continue to play a role. As an enabler, it's always useful to have the right technology. For example, one of the apps we developed called Coast mapped migrant workers geospatially wherever they were, and also mapped their destinations where they want to go back when they were wanting to, transition back, and the governments were allowing them to. So that app was used extensively by civil society organizations in sort of trying to streamline the movement of workers. And of course, we know that technology can play a very important role in accessing government benefits, and so on and so forth, right? So, and that will continue to be there, but that should not be the horse driving the cart. I'm going to stop.
Thanks, Narayan. And I think what you started off with is very important, the understanding of business and human rights. And I think one of the struggles that we've had when we were together involved in the National Action Plan process is to sort of, how do we get more and more companies to understand and be aware and buy into the idea of business and human rights. The implementation problem, enforcement is another challenge, but at least they can't, companies shouldn't have the excuse that we're not aware of. That certainly shouldn't happen. So I think that's an interesting way to look at it. But I think I also agree with you on this need for the regulator to get involved. But I think the question is, to get involved or to take it over is, I think, the line that you have to find, the fine line you have to draw. Anirban, your thoughts, and we are almost towards the end, but there was a very interesting, I was at a webinar yesterday when one of your former colleagues, Rajiv Dubey, was on that, and he made a very interesting comment. And he said that, it's the attitude of companies towards workers. If you look at workers as a cost, then you're going to end up throwing human rights out of the window. But if you look at workers as an investment, your whole approach becomes very different. And I thought that was a very interesting observation that he made. Just thinking, and in our sustainability journey, we say the same thing, right? Everything you look at as a cost, it's not worth it. But if you look at it as an investment, then you know that there is an enlightened return at the end. But just wondering whether how much of that philosophy is part of Mahindra's and your own thinking, and how do we take this forward to the next, and making sure that the next pandemic, we don't end up regretting that we didn't learn. You're on mute, Anirban.
Thanks to Rajiv, who you quoted, who just retired on March 31st. Looking at workers as an investment thanks to him, it's a part of our culture. And he was the head of group HR. So he was doing what he was talking about on the webinar. And, he's run a superb town like Jamshedpur. You know how well that is run. And he set up many of the systems at that time. So yes, and if looking at workers as an investment was not the way we looked at it within the group, then the package that I talked to you about, which I was pleasantly surprised with, was reasonably consistent across businesses, even though each of them came up with it themselves, kind of indicated that there is something common running across the businesses of the group when it comes to dealing with people. But let me address one or two things which have been discussed in the panel. One is this informality of labor. I think the expectation is things will become more formal. My expectation is it will keep getting more and more informal. And that probably comes from the experience I've had in somewhat more developed countries, where, as Ravi was speaking, I was thinking 60-70% of the people who work in my company would be classified as being precariously employed. Yet that was the norm in the country. So when we are looking at these definitions and we are looking at these labels, we've got to look at it in the context in which employment is being provided. So all I wanted to say is that the way things are going, and I must mention this, it's not necessarily a bad thing, because when I look at my daughter who's entering the labor force now, she wants to be a part of this contract labor force, not bound down to work forever for some company, quite happy to do an assignment for 2 years or 3 years or move on, or finish an assignment and move on and go somewhere else. And so there seems to be something going on in society where informality, as we call it, of work might just increase. Now, how we will deal with it equitably, how we will ensure that people are not at risk because they're making these choices, is important social questions. But in India, we certainly haven't started asking them. We start asking them now. If we have to set up a social security net, we've got to begin by saying that our social security net was given. Our problem is that the capacity is too low. In fact, capacity seems to be geared for a population of half of what it is today. About 50 years ago, 1980, when our population was almost exactly half of what it is today in India. Because if somebody has to go to an ESI hospital, you have a capacity problem. If somebody has to access anything that is there for labor, you have a capacity problem. And whenever there's a capacity problem, there will be vested interests, and the interests of the labor will not necessarily be served. So we have to build up capacity. Having said that, there are things that are being put in place. To my mind, and I may be ignorant about this, there are bigger experts on the subject here. When I see the combination of Jandhan, Aadhaar, Ayushman Bharat, the older VSIC,
I think we're losing, at least I'm not hearing bits and pieces in between. So I'm wondering whether you want to just switch off your video and speak, because you may be running into a bit of a bandwidth issue. Sorry.
Sure. No problem at all. Can you hear me better?
Yeah, this is good.
Okay. So I had mentioned that we should expect greater informality. And I was saying that I don't think we are ready to deal with the consequences of greater informality in the working sector. I'd moved on to saying that the problem we have is capacity. It's not that we don't have health for workers. We do, but not enough. And as a result, there are vested interests and people don't necessarily get access to the benefits they get. I was then saying that there are a few things happening which, if they come together, and if they come together at scale, we might be much better off. And the few things that were coming to my mind was a combination of Jandhan, Aadhaar, Ayushman, and maybe these are all lines being put into the fire. None of them are large enough yet. But if they were all
Sorry, Anirban, we lost you again. You said, I think we lost you when you said a combination of Jan Dhan, Aadhaar, and
Ayushman Bharat. And I was saying that if all of these were to come together at the right scale, we might end up with a more effective social security net. I think it's the right time to ask and the right time to shift social security on 3 dimensions: health, accommodation, and money. Because when I look at a migrant labor situation today, if he has access to money, if he has access to accommodation, and he has access to health, then probably his security net is reasonably strong to keep him going till he gets employed once again.
yeah, thanks, Anirban. Sorry, I think there was a bit of a bandwidth issue, but
okay, now that I'm not talking, you can see me again.
Yeah, good to see you again. So I'm just looking at the time, and I'm looking to Pooja to advise us on what we do. We are at 5 o'clock, and I'm sure you have tons and tons of questions, but I don't know whether there is more time. I don't know whether the panelists can spare a bit more time. So let me start with that. Can you folks give us another 10-15 minutes to take some questions from the floor?
That's entirely possible, yes.
So let me ask whether the panelists are available.
Shankar, do you want to ask if anybody's left listening to us?
Well, I'd rather, we'll just listen to the questions, Anirban, but it is an important question that we ask. So we're good to go for another 10 to 15 minutes? Okay, Pooja, why don't I quickly go to you, since we've had people listening to us patiently, and Anirban wonders how many of them are still listening to us patiently, but we might as well just go through some of the questions that came up. And if there is anyone specific pointing that the question is pointed to, mention it. Otherwise, I will figure out that.
Right.
So go ahead.
So the first set of questions on formalizing the informal sector, many of the queries have already been covered, so I'll skip those, but quickly going on to one pertinent question. Will setting up a migrant labor commission be useful? What can be the corporate's role in it?
Migrant Labor Commission. Ravi, do you want to speak to that? Has that been something which is there in the NCUS?
Yeah. Well, sorry, am I here?
Yeah.
So a migrant labor commission set up in a source state can serve very little purpose. But yes, a migrant labor commission being set up at the all India level, which lays down the contours of policy. We are one of the few countries, which doesn't have a policy for internal migration. We work much more on international migration than on internal migration, and there we can look at all kinds of issues, including issues of rights, portability, registration, and so on. So I think that at the country level, will give much more visibility and insert migrants in the policy space, which is of course dramatically needed.
Any role that for companies in that, Ravi, and any of the others? And then I would like either Anirban or Narayan to also speak to that. Role for companies in such a commission?
Absolutely. I mean, companies have I think all these dialogues have to be carried across, the most important stakeholders, which are the workers themselves, the employers, and the government. And this, saying that it should be tripartite makes it very trite. But I think it's necessary to have the three stakeholders together in all. These should not be expert commissions alone.
You need to have an egalitarian boundary, an egalitarian set of principles.
Yeah.
Otherwise, after you set the principles, the three will start fighting amongst each other anyway.
Okay. Pooja?
Yeah, so could the corporates use a vendor development approach towards rural MSMEs?
So I think what it is probably the question is probably trying to say, and I'm just guessing, is can you sort of, do people need to migrate to a particular place, or can you have ancillary units which are where they live, and can you just have a vendor system like that? I think it was tried in, I remember in the old days, we used to talk about how it was done in Thailand a lot, but that is, I think, the question. So Anirban, perhaps your best place to answer that, because it's a very manufacturing kind of thing.
Well, the choice of location of where to set up the unit is a very complicated choice. Source of labor is only one of them. So I guess whatever is the most appropriate decision for the company, labor, money, land, technology, the whole thing put together. But I did find something interesting while I was speaking to my colleagues in the group. We didn't have a migrant worker problem in our holidays resorts business at all. And we didn't have a migrant worker problem simply because they are usually amongst the largest local employers of the place where they are located. And so that's a business where you can work with as much local people as possible. So whatever can be done in an area in terms of economic value addition, it's worth looking at it from that perspective and build economic value addition in those areas. You know, we used to have this policy of putting factories in back of beyond places that had its pluses and minuses. Of course, we then went ahead and did that other freight equalization policy and messed things up. So there are multiple levers that one has to pull, but whatever is sustainable in an area, I think economic value addition from that activity is the best thing for that area.
Anyone else wants to weigh in to that? Orlando, yeah, please go ahead.
Yeah. In earlier jobs, I've worked much more closely with employers than I am at the moment. So it's nice to hear the employer voices. And I've watched various companies, particularly in the garment industry, go towards the labor. Yeah. So shift from those in urban industrial areas in the key developed parts of the countries where real estate becomes very expensive towards those states where the labor is coming. The problem is that they still prefer migrants. I mean, I'm putting it a bit simply, but I think we should be realistic about what industry wants. Why do they like migrants? Well, number one, migrants work longer hours, and their attendance is better. Number two, they cause less trouble because they don't have local and political connections. And number three, I think the companies that I got to know, they like to hedge between local workers from whom they often have attendance problems to migrant workers from whom they can expect attrition at particular times of year. Yeah. So if they have half local and half migrant, then they're able to cover their bases. And I think that part of our social security going forward needs to absolutely recognize that migrants are here to stay and they're just going to grow.
Yeah. Thank you, Orlando. That's a very useful perspective. Yeah. Pooja, go ahead.
Yeah, so the next question around social security, a lot has been covered, but one question, how can corporate India advocate for social security of migrant workers? Besides, how can they provide social protection to migrants? This is how can they advocate for social security of migrant workers?
Okay, so I think to some extent, I think one of our, a couple of our discussants had mentioned a different role for business, not just as providers, but also as advocates. Amitabh, I think you also spoke to that a bit. Do you want to elaborate on that thought, Amitabh? And then I would ask Narayan also to speak to that.
I'm not sure, Shankar, if I would respond to the question straight. But broadly speaking, yes, I do think that corporates have a huge responsibility in terms of not just looking at their own entire supply chains, but that was the larger point I was trying to make. And I think that's where the question is, that how do we bring back, at least in terms of our imagination, the architecture of social security, which we're kind of very comfortably getting away from. So corporates can have a very, very critical role in building a public narrative about social security. And it should actually go beyond that. I would very strongly say it's essentially looking at the question of rights. As in, for instance, just look at the idea of health at the moment. If we had a better performing public health system, we would probably have had been far lesser hit in terms of what's happening. So that's a critical piece. As in, and Anirban talked of, I think, Ayushman Bharat. There are several lessons that can you really look at privatization of these basic services as a potential way out. I would say no. This is something which is a state function, and that's why I was talking of the largest social contract. So the corporates have to recognize that there cannot be profits in basic services. Thank you.
Shankar, let me simplify this a little. A social security net will cost money. Where can the money come from? It can only come from two places: our taxes or the salary paid to the individual, a portion of that going towards creation of a social security net. Different countries have dealt with it in different ways. The way we choose to deal with it, we've got to find a way of funding the social security net. If we say that we are paying adequate taxes and the social security net should be funded through that, that's one position. The other way to say is, most of us in the later parts of our career have graduated to a form of compensation called cost to company, where whatever is given to you goes into that list. So and a part of that actually goes into retirement benefits, which come to us, and some of it goes for PF. A little bit can go towards creation of a social security net. So that could be a way of funding. So in that way, you would find corporates also making a contribution. But there are two fundamental sources: either the money that is being earned by the person or the taxes that is being paid by some people in the country.
Narayan, you want to weigh into that?
Yeah, so I'm in broad agreement with that. I just want to say, you look at the entire spectrum of why business should get involved in advocacy on social security, from the one pole position of enlightened corporate citizenship, which probably a few organizations might have the appetite for, to the other end of a more narrow economic self-interest. If there is indeed a functioning social security system that works, whether it is funded by the government or partially by government and partially by business, it's good for business because then you have the demand side of the economic equation not drying up. But that's the top reason given by corporations, as to why they have to furlough workers or shut down businesses either partially or whatever. Is in times like this, demand drops drastically. If you have social security of some kind, you will have demand for essentials still going rather than being in a precarious position. So look at it from either end of the spectrum. It's good from a business point of view to be an active advocate on this.
I think the question does boil down to who will start this dialogue, because government is a natural place for it, but government in some ways claims that it has some sort of a social security or it has created those conditions for that, but we know it doesn't work. But if you have to rebuild this or re-architecture it in the way all of you are saying, I'm just wondering what is the starting point of that? Any thoughts? Because somebody has to start that engine, prime that pump for it to sort of start, like discussions to start happening.
So Shankar, if you say let's build capacity, government won't think they have nothing. People can all participate. It's a building up exercise. It's not a criticizing exercise. It's a structuring exercise. It's not something that you're beginning from the beginning. So somehow I think the conversation on building capacity for social security has power to pull people together. But then what do I know too much? I don't know too much about this.
Yeah, but I'm just wondering whether this is something where companies should start showing some leadership and saying, okay, this is the new corporate India. Let's start ideating about this and let's start finding new solutions because the old ones haven't worked. And as Narayan said, it is in self-interest also. There is a self-interest to be gained. There is a interest for workers in this, and it is a larger dialogue. So I'm just wondering whether that's a starting point. But anyway, it's a longer debate. We should leave it at that. I'm just wondering, Pooja, do we have time for more or should we?
I think we can just take one or two more questions. So going forward, what is the collaborative action that corporates and NGOs can take to support the migrants, both those who are returning to the villages and those who are returning back to cities like Bangalore, but getting only 2 to 3 days of work per week?
How can civil society and companies work collaboratively in the current situation?
Yes.
What they're talking.
Yes, to support the migrants, those who are returning back to the villages and those who are returning back to cities, but only getting 2 to 3 days of work per week.
Amitabh, Ravi, any perspectives on that?
Amitabh, would you?
So thank you. I think we've talked a lot about it, and there are going to be multiple pieces on which the collaboration is needed. One is the responsible action from the businesses. How do you start shifting the conversation towards human rights? On the other hand, if it's a short-term intervention that we're looking at, and probably the question is hinting more towards the short term, then it is really enabling civil society. And a lot of civil society in India at the moment does receive support from corporates, from CSR and from philanthropies. So at this moment, understanding the need of civil society, both in investing in core cost of civil society, being flexible with its funding support, willingness to change the agreed uh, plan of actions for their existing grants, and also being dynamic in supporting the new initiatives. So that there can be this relationship can be very powerful, and without this relationship, it's unlikely that we'll be able to really support the migrant workers and even address the crisis even to the small fraction we can.
Shankar, the way I look at it is that, in the last 3 months, civil society organizations, and I've interacted with several hundred actually over the last few weeks, months, have acquired deep insights into what has happened in urban areas, migrants going back, and now in the rural areas. And I think the partnership between corporates and civil society is not just a question of relief and any longer. I think this partnership must result in asking the relevant questions. How do we not go back to business as usual? What can we do now? And learning from the deep ground level experience which has emanated in the last 3 months. Because the risk is that companies will struggle to get back on their feet. They will stop thinking beyond their noses and ultimately go back to a scenario where it is business as usual. And I think CSOs can nurture in them a greater sense of, partnership towards how do we work towards something else.
I think that's a very good idea, Ravi. And I'm just wondering whether, researchers like yourselves can put some of these lessons together, because as you said, there's so many civil society. You talked about hundreds, and each one of them have a learning. How do we sort of bring that together? How do we make sense out of a lot of that? I think that becomes a new challenge. But what I'm hearing you say is that there is the financial angle which Amitabh alluded to, but there's also a knowledge angle, and both are, I think, critical to build back better as we go forward. Orlando, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, I just wanted to share briefly some very positive experience we had in Tirupur district in Tamil Nadu, which depends on migrants by about 30 or 40%. So here, the district administration has sustained its focus on getting rations to the interstate migrants on showing Aadhaar card. So as long as they show the Aadhaar card, they can get access. And the latest report is that that's going on. It carries on in spite of the fact that lockdown is officially ended. So all the workers who stayed down there for the duration of lockdown and have hedged their bets waiting for work to come their way are able to get cheap food. Yeah. The other thing, of course, is Tamil Nadu, unlike some destination governments, Tamil Nadu didn't change its labor laws. So it still has the same framework that it had before lockdown, while Gujarat has gone on a slippery slope downwards. So that's also very encouraging. So these are two major contributions, and both of those things are a result of civil society close engagement with government. It's both government and civil society, both. Yeah.
Okay, so I think, I think we are at 5:25, and I think we should start closing. Anirban, something you want to quickly say? Yeah.
One quick pipe dream. It would be amazing if in centers of high migrant worker population, we ended up, as a result of the COVID experience, with migrant worker accommodation colonies. Don't have time to build on it, but one word, learning Singapore.
Which is a bit of a double-edged sword, but yeah, I hear you. Okay, so Pooja, I think we should call this to an end.
Yes, we have no question left, but I think we are running out of time now.
Yeah. So thank you again, Amitabh, Narayan, Anirban, Ordanda, Ravi. It's been fantastic, as always, listening to you, hearing your voices. And I think the interplay of ideas was very interesting. Like all these webinars, we just never have enough time. And I would actually urge access to, once we put all these thoughts that we got today together, to maybe do a second volume, so to speak, of this, where we start from where we left off and do a shorter one, but let's see whether we can get to a little bit more closure and take some of these ideas that we developed today into a little bit more detail. I think that would be my wish. Since you had a wish list of one, Anirban, that's my wish list. Because I think such minds getting together is not very often, and you know, we need to try and find to maximize that. So thank you all very much for being part of this. It's been wonderful as always chatting with you. Conversations with old friends is always a pleasure, and this was one of them. And I also want to thank the participants for being patiently with us and for your questions, which I hope we managed to, our great discussants managed to address to your satisfaction. But clearly, I learned a lot from this, and thank you all, and we'll see you soon, inshallah.
Thanks a lot.
Bye.
Lovely meeting everyone.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you.